The morning after my husband's funeral, I opened his laptop and saw the life he hid from me. The morning after my husband's funeral moved slowly, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I woke before sunrise, lying still in the dim light, listening to the refrigerator hum down the hall and the soft ticking of the bedroom clock. The air felt cool on my arms, and for a moment I stayed wrapped in the blanket, unsure how to step into a day that no longer included him. When I sat up, I saw the indentation on his side of the bed. It looked deeper than usual, as if he had just risen a moment ago. I reached out but stopped before my fingers touched the fabric. The space felt like something sacred, and I wasn't ready to disturb it. Walking down the hallway, the creaking boards under my feet sounded louder in the silence. The framed photos along the wall felt different now, small glimpses of a life that already seemed distant. In one picture from years ago, he stood beside me with his familiar controlled smile. I used to think it meant steadiness. That morning, it looked more like a mask. In the kitchen, yesterday's coffee sat untouched in the pot. My sister must have made it before the service, hoping I would drink something, but everything tasted wrong yesterday. I touched the cold mug, feeling the chill move into my fingers. The faint smell of flowers from the funeral arrangements lingered in the air, sweet but heavy. I drifted toward his office, guided more by instinct than intention. The blinds were half closed, letting in thin bands of light that fell across the desk. His jacket hung on the back of the chair, carrying the faint scent of his cologne. I paused, letting the familiarity settle over me before stepping inside. His laptop sat in the center of the desk, the lid closed but not perfectly aligned. He usually kept things neat, so the slight shift caught my eye. A thin line of dust traced the edges, though the middle looked recently wiped. I placed my hand on top of it, feeling the cool surface, and a small tremor moved through me. I didn't plan to open it. My thoughts were scattered, still tangled with everything that had happened. Yet my fingers lingered on the lid, tracing the edge the way he often did when he was thinking. The gesture made my throat tighten in a way I didn't expect. I sat in his chair, the leather cool beneath me. From there, I noticed the little details of his workspace. Pens neatly arranged, unopened mail stacked to the side, a faint scratch near the mousepad I hadn't seen before. The room smelled faintly of paper and the last cup of coffee he must have left behind. The quiet felt heavy. A mug with a dried ring sat near the monitor. A torn corner of a receipt peeked out from under a notebook. Small things that suggested he had been rushing or distracted in the days before he died. Those details tugged at me more than I wanted to admit. Dust drifted in the beams of morning light, moving slowly. I watched it float and felt the weight of the moment settle more firmly on my shoulders. Grief had a way of making time feel unfamiliar, stretching and slowing until everything felt slightly out of sync. I lifted the laptop lid an inch. The soft click sounded loud in the still room. My breath caught, and I let the lid fall shut again. The decision to open it felt too big for that moment. My emotions were raw, stretched thin, and touching anything of his felt like stepping too close to something I wasn't ready to face. I sat with my hands resting on the closed laptop, grounding myself in the stillness. It was the first time since the funeral that I felt completely alone. No voices offering comfort, no rustling coats, no polite attempts to fill the silence. Just me and the quiet truth of the day after losing him. I didn't try to open it again. Not that morning. Even simple choices felt fragile, and I didn't trust myself to handle what might be waiting inside. I stayed there until the sunlight reached the far edge of the room, warming the carpet and brushing against my ankle. When I finally stood, I left the laptop exactly where it was. The room felt heavier as I stepped out, but my breathing felt a little steadier, as if acknowledging the weight of everything was its own small step forward. I knew I would return to it someday, but not yet. Not in the first morning of learning how to live without him. I closed the door gently behind me, letting the quiet settle one more time. Finally, the house felt different the next morning, as if it had exhaled after holding itself tense for too long. I walked slowly through the hallway, feeling the faint draft that always came through the front windows, but it felt colder now, sharper. Each step sounded too loud, as if the floors were reacting to the quiet he left behind. The world outside was waking up, but inside, everything stayed muted, wrapped in the stillness that follows the end of something you thought would last forever. In the living room, the flowers from the funeral were still everywhere. Lilies, roses, small cards tucked in between them. Their scent had grown heavier overnight, almost overwhelming. I brushed my hand over one of the white petals, feeling how soft and cool it was, and it made my chest tighten in a familiar ache. People had left them as gestures of sympathy, but standing among them felt strange, like standing inside a reminder that his absence was now permanent. My sister had spent the night, but she'd left early, quietly. On the counter, she'd placed a note and a small container of food, but even her handwriting, a small looping script, felt distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. I read it once, nodded to myself, then set it aside. The house didn't feel like a place where anyone had been. It felt hollow, stripped of the noise and warmth we used to fill it with, even on our worst days. I drifted toward the dining table, running my fingers lightly along the wood. There were small scratches on it from years ago, little marks from nights when he set his keys down too hard, or when we moved the chairs too quickly. I remembered those sounds, those tiny ordinary moments, and how they used to annoy me or make me laugh. Now they felt like markers of a life I wasn't sure how to look back on. My phone buzzed with a message from someone offering their condolences. I didn't open it. I didn't open any messages. The idea of replying felt exhausting, like stepping into another conversation I wasn't ready for. I stared at the screen until it dimmed again, the soft glow fading from my hand. Even the smallest interactions felt like too much. Grief has a way of shrinking your world, narrowing everything down to the breath in your chest and whatever sits directly in front of you. I made myself a cup of coffee even though I barely wanted it. The warmth in my hands felt grounding. Steam drifted upward in small wisps, curling toward the window. I took a sip, tasting the bitterness. For a moment, I let it settle, hoping it would anchor me to the morning in some way. But it only made the silence feel more pronounced, like the edges of the room were pushing inward. Eventually, my eyes drifted again toward his office door. It was slightly ajar, and the thin strip of darkness inside seemed to pull at me. I paused in the doorway, gripping the mug a little tighter. I didn't step inside this time. I just stood there, listening to the faint hum of the air vent overhead and feeling the coolness of the doorframe under my fingers. The laptop was still on the desk where I'd left it yesterday. Just knowing that was enough to send a small wave of unease through me. I felt the weight of it without even touching it. There was something about that device, his device, that made me feel like he wasn't entirely gone. It held pieces of him I hadn't seen, thoughts he hadn't shared, habits I'd never questioned. The idea of all of that sitting there, waiting, made my stomach shift uncomfortably. I stepped back, letting the door move slightly. A narrow beam of light cut across the office floor, catching dust particles drifting lazily in the air. It reminded me of how I used to peek into the room when he was on late-night calls, the glow of the screen reflecting in his glasses. Sometimes he'd look so focused that I didn't dare interrupt. Other times he'd seem miles away, lost in a world I couldn't access. I used to chalk it up to work stress. Now I wasn't sure. Moving away from the door again, I wandered back into the living room. I sat on the couch and let the back cushions cradle me. The fabric felt slightly cool, almost unfamiliar. The cushion beside me still held a faint indentation from a night not too long ago when he'd fallen asleep there after a long day. I pressed my hand into that space without fully knowing why. Grief makes you reach for things you don't expect. My breathing grew steadier as I let myself sit there, letting the morning settle around me. There was no urgency pressing on me, no tasks demanding attention. Just quiet. Heavy, complicated quiet. I felt the ache rise and fall like a slow tide. Manageable for a moment, then sharper, then easing again. I didn't think about the laptop again, not directly. But the weight of the office stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind like a faint echo. I wasn't ready to go back inside. I wasn't ready to open anything that belonged to him. Not yet. The truth was simple. I needed one more morning to exist inside the version of my life where grief was the only thing I had to face. So I sat a little longer, letting sunlight stretch across the room in soft golden lines, warming my legs and the fabric beneath me. For now, that was enough. I used to believe our love story began the way most steady marriages did. Quietly, gently, without too many complications. Back then, I couldn't have imagined a future where I'd sit alone in a quiet house, trying to understand the pieces he left behind. But as I let myself think back to those early years, the memories didn't come in warm, comforting waves. They came in fragments, each one carrying a different shade of truth I hadn't fully seen at the time. The morning light through the living room window made everything look softer, but the memories still cut in their own way. When we first met, he had this confident calmness about him, the kind of presence that made you feel safe before you even knew his last name. He smiled easily. He listened closely. I remember thinking that he seemed older than he was, not by age but by how composed he looked. That composure drew me in. It made me trust him quickly, maybe too quickly. Even now, I could picture his early gestures. The way he'd place his hand on the small of my back when we crossed the street. The way he'd look directly into my eyes as if he already knew what I was going to say next. But looking back, I also remember the first moments where something felt just slightly off. Subtle things. He kept his phone face down. He never left the room while it was unlocked. He always had a reason ready. He valued privacy, or he hated distractions, or he'd learned bad habits from his job. I didn't think much of it then. Felt too small to matter. I was young, and I mistook confidence for stability. In those early days, everything between us moved quickly. He was attentive in ways that felt generous. He remembered tiny details I mentioned, like the kind of chocolates I liked or the streets that made me anxious when driving. He showed up with surprises, flowers, takeout from my favorite place, or plans for a last-minute weekend drive. I used to joke that he seemed to know me better than I knew myself. At the time, it felt flattering. Now, I wonder if he was simply studying me, learning how to guide the parts of the relationship he wanted to keep hidden. One thing that stands out in hindsight is how rarely he talked about his past. Whenever I asked about his childhood or his family, he'd give small pieces, enough to answer the question but never enough to form a picture. He'd say his parents were distant, or that he'd learned early to take care of himself. The answers always sounded smooth. Tidy. Too tidy. I never pushed. I thought respecting boundaries was a form of love, and maybe it was. But sometimes it's also a way of letting someone control the narrative. I remember one night during our first year together. We were sitting on the couch after dinner, the TV humming softly in the background. His phone lit up on the table, and he grabbed it so quickly that I actually jumped a little. He didn't raise his voice or seem angry, but there was something sharp in the way he held the phone to his chest. It passed quickly. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said it was just a work thing. I believed him. I brushed it off and let the moment dissolve into the rest of the evening. He had a way of making moments like that disappear. If something felt uncomfortable, he'd smooth it over with a compliment or a gentle touch. His charm wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, practiced. At the time, I thought I was lucky to have someone so composed. Now, as I sat in the stillness of the house, I felt the weight of how much I'd ignored. Another memory surfaced with surprising clarity. We had gone to a friend's barbecue during our second summer together. It was one of those hot afternoons where the air felt thick and laughter carried easily. I'd stepped inside to grab more napkins when I overheard him in the hallway, speaking in a low tone to someone on the phone. The conversation was short, tense, urgent. I remember stopping behind the wall, listening to the shift in his voice, calm but clipped. When he came back outside, he acted as though nothing had happened. I asked if everything was okay, and he nodded without hesitation, telling me it was just work again. Back then, I told myself every relationship had these little uncertainties. People had complicated lives. Jobs could be demanding. Not every detail needed to make sense. But as I sat in the house now, the memories lined up differently. They seemed to glow faintly at the edges, signaling the things I should have noticed earlier. He was always careful with his boundaries, but never in a way that seemed harsh. He encouraged me to share but didn't reciprocate with the same openness. When I'd ask deeper questions, he would smile, brush a thumb across my hand, and say he wasn't good at talking about himself. I interpreted that as vulnerability. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was just a tactic to keep me from seeing more than he intended. As I continued thinking back, another detail surfaced. His habit of coming home late but always with an explanation prepared. Traffic was bad. A call ran long. He got stuck helping someone. His explanations were always reasonable, almost perfectly so. And I never checked. I never doubted. I trusted the man he presented himself to be because I wanted to believe in us. By the time we married, I thought we had built something strong. But even on our wedding day, there were moments of distance I couldn't quite place. During the reception, he stepped outside twice for calls. When he returned, he had that same fixed calmness I had grown used to. I told myself weddings were chaotic. People needed breathers. It wasn't worth turning into something bigger. Sitting in the quiet house now, with the morning light shifting slowly across the floor, those memories didn't feel dramatic or explosive. They just felt different, like puzzle pieces that only made sense once I was willing to see the full picture. And realizing that, even gently, pressed a new ache into my chest that I end the early years of our marriage. Life settled into a rhythm that felt predictable in the way I thought marriages were supposed to be. We both worked long hours, came home tired, and tried to make space for each other in the gaps between responsibilities. The house we bought together became our anchor. 3 bedrooms, a quiet street, a porch that always needed repainting. I remember how proud he was when we signed the papers, how he gripped my hand a little too tightly, as though securing something he feared might slip away. At the time, I thought it was excitement. Now, I'm not as sure. He had a habit of staying up late, long after I went to bed. I'd hear the soft clicking of the keyboard from his office or the low murmur of his voice when he took calls. Sometimes I'd wake up around midnight and find the other side of the bed still empty, the sheets cool to the touch. I'd wander down the hallway, peek into his office, and see him hunched over the desk, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses. He'd glance up, give me a tired smile, and tell me he'd be right there. And most nights, he eventually was. But the hours he spent awake while I slept began to create a space between us that I couldn't quite name. There were evenings when he seemed distracted, his eyes drifting past me even as we sat together on the couch. He'd respond when I spoke, but his mind always seemed elsewhere, like he was balancing 2 different conversations in his head. I used to chalk it up to stress. His job required a certain level of intensity, and he often carried that tension home. But every now and then, the way he'd check the time or reach for his phone a little too quickly made something uneasy stir in me. He was careful, though, always careful. He never raised his voice, never acted in ways that were outwardly suspicious. If anything, he was almost too composed. Even when we disagreed, his calmness felt unshakable. I mistook that for emotional maturity. Only later did I realize how much of himself he kept pulled inward, behind layers I never truly penetrated. There was one particular night that stands out. We'd gone out for dinner after a stressful week. The restaurant was dimly lit, the kind of place where conversations blended together in a soft hum. After we ordered, he stepped out to take a call, apologizing with that same practiced gentleness. I watched him through the window as he moved toward the sidewalk, raising the phone to his ear. The streetlight cast an amber glow on his face, and I noticed how tense his posture became. His free hand curled slightly at his side, his shoulders pulled tight. He didn't see me watching, and something about the expression he wore, focused, urgent, almost anxious, stayed with me long after we left. Over time, these moments collected like dust on a shelf. Tiny, quiet, easy to ignore if I didn't look too closely. But every now and then, one detail would stand out. The way he'd close his laptop the moment I walked into the room. The way he'd angle his phone away from me. The way he'd say he was tired but his eyes looked too awake, too alert, like he was waiting for something I couldn't see. The mornings were often better. He'd wrap an arm around me before getting out of bed, his warmth steady, his breathing soft. Those small gestures made me feel safe, anchored. I held onto them tightly, as though the tenderness he offered in those moments outweighed the strange distance that crept in during the day. But now, sitting in the quiet house after his funeral, those memories felt more complicated. Comforting, yes, but also tinged with the realization that I didn't truly know what he carried beneath those soft moments. He had routines he never broke. Every Tuesday evening, he went for a run. Every Thursday, he had a standing work meeting that always ran late. On weekends, he liked to take the car for long drives to clear his mind. I used to admire his discipline, the way he created structure for himself. But when I replayed those routines in my head now, they didn't feel as steady as they once did. They felt like patterns he created on purpose, consistent enough that I stopped questioning them. One afternoon, about 3 years into our marriage, I found a key in his jacket pocket while doing laundry. It was small, silver, and attached to a plain black ring. I assumed it belonged to a filing cabinet at work. When I asked him about it later, he nodded quickly and slipped it into his drawer without offering more details. I didn't push, but something about how swiftly he tucked it away made a quiet ripple inside me. Not quite fear, not quite suspicion, just something. Another detail I never fully understood was his relationship with his phone. It wasn't unusual for people to be protective of their devices, but his care bordered on ritualistic. The phone was always locked, always in his pocket or face down on the table. If he walked into another room, it went with him. Even when he showered, he'd place it on the bathroom counter within reach. I still remember the sound of notifications pinging behind the closed door, muffled but persistent. Despite all of this, I loved him. Or at least, I loved the version of him he allowed me to see. He was thoughtful, responsible, attentive in the moments that mattered. He made me laugh with quiet jokes. He held me through bad days. He made promises about growing old together, sitting on that same porch we always talked about fixing. I believed him wholeheartedly. But grief has a strange way of reshaping memories. Sitting now in the quiet after his death, the edges of those early years didn't look as smooth as they once had. They held tiny cracks, thin but unmistakable, waiting for the right angle of light to reveal them. And slowly, in that silent house, those cracks began to glow. The first real sign that something wasn't quite right came during a trip we took to the coast about 4 years into our marriage. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Nothing extravagant. Just 2 nights near the water so we could reset and breathe outside our usual routine. I'd been excited for it, craving time with him in a way I hadn't admitted to myself before. He'd been distant the weeks leading up to it, more than usual, and I convinced myself that a change of scenery would bring us back into sync. I packed sandwiches for the drive, double-checked the reservations, and tried not to notice how distracted he seemed as we drove toward the shoreline. The first night was calm. We walked along the boardwalk, ate dinner at a small seafood place, and watched the sun sink into the horizon. But even in those quiet moments, I sensed a heaviness in him. His eyes drifted toward his phone more than the waves. When he laughed at something I said, it felt like an echo of a laugh rather than something genuine. I remember touching his arm as we walked and feeling how tense his muscles were beneath my fingers. He blamed it on work stress, but the explanation felt thinner than the ocean air brushing against us. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I stepped out onto the small balcony of our hotel room. The air smelled like salt and damp wood. As I leaned on the railing and listened to the distant crash of waves, I thought about how different this trip felt compared to our earlier ones. Back then, he'd hold my hand constantly, point things out excitedly, talk about all the places he wanted to explore with me. This time, he seemed like a shadow of that man, present physically but drifting somewhere I couldn't reach. The next morning offered another subtle warning. We were having breakfast at a small cafe near the pier, and his phone buzzed twice in quick succession. He didn't check it immediately, but something in his posture changed. He straightened, his shoulders tightened, and his eyes flicked briefly toward the screen. I tried to keep the conversation going, stirring my coffee slowly, pretending not to notice how unsettled he looked. When he finally glanced at the message, his expression shifted so quickly I almost missed it. It was something like alarm, thin, fleeting, and immediately covered by a practiced calm. He excused himself to make a quick call, leaving his half-eaten omelet on the table. I watched him through the cafe window as he stepped outside and crossed the street, lowering his voice as he spoke into the phone. His free hand moved in small gestures, agitated, precise, controlled. I couldn't hear anything, but the conversation looked intense. When he returned, he apologized and pressed a kiss to my forehead, promising it was nothing I needed to worry about. But the moment clung to me for the rest of the trip, like a burr stuck to the back of my mind. There were other moments too, small, quiet, easily dismissed at the time. One afternoon, I walked into his office at home without knocking, hoping to ask if he wanted coffee. He minimized a window so quickly it almost looked like a reflex. He smiled at me, warm and unbothered, but the tension in his shoulders told a different story. When I asked what he was working on, he gave a vague answer that didn't match the spreadsheets I thought I caught a glimpse of. Still, I let it go. I trusted him. Or maybe I trusted the version of him I wanted to believe in. He always had explanations ready before I even formed the questions. If he came home late, he'd already crafted a reason. If he seemed distracted, he'd offer a gentle reassurance. If something felt off, he'd smooth it over with a familiarity that made doubting him feel unreasonable. I didn't realize then how much I relied on his confidence to anchor my own understanding of our life. One evening, not long after that trip, I found a receipt tucked into the back pocket of his jeans while doing laundry. It was for a restaurant I'd never heard of. Expensive, upscale, nowhere near his office or anywhere he'd normally go. The date didn't match any night he was home for dinner. I held the slip of paper for a long time trying to make sense of it. When I finally asked him, he didn't miss a beat. He told me he'd met a colleague there for a work conversation that needed privacy. His voice was steady, his eyes unwavering. And because he sounded so sure, I convinced myself there was nothing more to it. But the moment lingered. It hovered in the background of my thoughts, joining all the other small inconsistencies that I pushed aside. A forgotten scent on his jacket that didn't belong to either of us. A charge on our credit card he couldn't fully explain. A message preview that vanished too quickly when he realized I'd seen it. Still, nothing was dramatic enough to set off alarms. Nothing felt urgent enough to confront directly. It was all just subtle, soft, easy to ignore if I chose to, and I did choose to, over and over again. Now, sitting alone in the silence of the house after his funeral, the memory of those early warning signs felt sharper. They weren't loud or obvious, but they were there. Tiny whispers in the background, nudging me toward a truth I hadn't been ready to see. And with the weight of the laptop waiting in his office, those whispers felt louder than ever that I didn't open the laptop that morning. Not yet. Something in me wasn't ready for whatever waited inside it. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold, staring at the blank wall as if the answers might be written there instead. The silence of the house felt heavier than usual, pressing down on me until even my breath sounded too loud. I kept telling myself I would get up in a minute, just one more minute, but I stayed frozen, with my fingers curled around the cup like it was the only thing keeping me anchored. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady, as if grief had hollowed out the bones. I moved slowly through the living room, touching the back of the couch, the edge of the picture frame, the corner of the bookshelf, trying to reassure myself that the world was still solid. The air smelled faintly of cedar from the candle I used during the week of the funeral, and the scent made something behind my ribs ache. I wasn't sure if it was love or anger or a mixture too tangled to separate. I told myself I was just cleaning when I picked up the sweater he'd left draped over the chair 2 weeks before he died. The fabric was soft, still carrying a trace of his cologne, and as I held it, a strange chill crawled up my spine. I pressed the sweater to my face, searching for comfort, but instead a wave of unease washed through me so sharp it made my hands tremble. I didn't know why. Nothing had changed. Nothing had happened. Yet my body reacted as though a warning had just sounded deep inside me. I folded the sweater and placed it gently in the drawer. It felt like a small goodbye, even though I wasn't ready for any more goodbyes. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I steadied myself against the dresser, taking a slow breath. The light leaking through the blinds was pale and cold, catching dust particles in the air like drifting snow. I watched them float, suspended, weightless. My heart felt the opposite, heavy, dragging. When I walked back toward the living room, my eyes landed on the laptop still sitting on the coffee table. The lid was closed, the black surface smooth and unassuming, but it practically glowed with unspoken questions. I took 3 steps toward it, then stopped. Something inside me recoiled. I turned away and went into the kitchen to wash a few plates that didn't really need washing. The warm water soothed my hands, but not the rest of me. Every few seconds, my gaze drifted toward the living room doorway. The house creaked as the furnace kicked on, making me jump slightly. I felt ridiculous. This was my home, my safe place. But without him, it suddenly felt like a stranger's house. Familiar in shape, wrong in feeling. I dried my hands slowly, the towel snagging on my wedding ring for a moment. The sensation startled me. I stared at the ring, remembering how he'd slid it onto my finger with trembling hands, looking at me like I was the one steady thing in his entire life. My throat tightened. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes until the pressure behind them eased. When I opened them again, the hallway felt darker. I flipped on the overhead light, but the brightness only made the shadows look sharper. Something in my mind whispered that maybe I shouldn't be alone right now, that maybe grief was starting to twist reality. But I pushed the thought away. I wasn't losing my grip. I was just tired. Still, there was a strange energy in the house, a subtle shift I couldn't name, like the air itself was waiting for me to acknowledge something. I found myself checking the front door even though I knew it was locked. Then I scanned the living room window to make sure the curtain was closed properly. My movements were slow, deliberate, like my instincts had woken up from a long sleep and were urging me to be alert. I finally walked back to the laptop and sat down on the couch. My fingers hovered above the lid, barely touching it. The cool metal sent a tiny jolt through me. I lifted my hand and stared at it, suddenly aware of how cold my skin felt. I rubbed my palms together, trying to warm them, but the chill lingered. Instead of opening the laptop, I reached for the worn blanket draped across the armrest and wrapped it around my shoulders. The fabric smelled like detergent and faint lavender. I pulled it tighter, trying to quiet the uneasy flutter in my stomach. I told myself again that I was just grieving, just overwhelmed, that everything felt strange because I felt strange. But deep down, something else stirred, something sharper, quieter, older, an instinct I couldn't fully name, a subtle tension in the back of my mind that whispered, something isn't right. I didn't open the laptop. Not that day. I couldn't have explained why, but the moment didn't feel right. The air felt wrong. My thoughts felt scattered. So instead, I closed my eyes and rested my head against the couch, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock. The world felt like it was holding its breath, and I found myself holding mine too. The next morning, I couldn't resist it any longer. I returned to the living room with a mix of dread and curiosity that felt almost physical, like a weight pressing against my chest. The laptop sat where I had left it, black and quiet, innocent yet somehow alive. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the lid, feeling the cold metal under my palms. A faint hum vibrated from the machine as it powered up, and the sound made my heart beat faster. I realized with a sinking feeling that once I started, there was no turning back. The desktop was cluttered but organized in a way that suggested deliberate control. Folders I hadn't noticed before lined the edges of the screen, some with names that made no sense, others labeled vaguely, projects, personal, archives. I clicked on the first folder, the one that seemed ordinary. Inside, I found documents, lists, spreadsheets, and notes that he had clearly kept hidden from me. Small things at first glance. A work plan here, a grocery list there. But the deeper I scrolled, the more I felt a tightening in my chest. Some of these files were clearly private, personal in ways he hadn't shared, and the sheer breadth of them made my stomach churn. There were emails too. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the mouse, before opening the first message. The sender's name was unfamiliar, but the tone of the email was intimate, almost familiar in a way that made my throat constrict. Quickly closed it, my mind racing. I hadn't imagined it. The signs were real. Something had been hidden from me for years. The realization landed slowly, like a weight that grows heavier the longer you ignore it. I told myself to breathe, but my lungs felt tight. The next folder revealed more: travel bookings, credit card statements, receipts for places I had never been. Restaurants, hotels, and even gifts that didn't make sense. They were small individually, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I sat back on the couch, running my hands down my face, feeling my pulse thump behind my temples. Each discovery pushed me further down a path I wasn't sure I wanted to take, but couldn't stop. I opened another file. It was a spreadsheet with dates, times, and locations. My stomach lurched as I realized it was a log of his movements, meticulously tracked. Some nights overlapped with explanations he had given me that didn't add up. He had hidden things with precision. Everything lined up like clockwork, and the evidence of his separate life stared me in the face, undeniable. My hands shook as I scrolled through, gripping the edges of the couch cushions until my nails left faint marks in the fabric. There was a folder with photographs. At first, I thought they were just work-related, pictures of events he had attended. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't meant for public eyes. He had taken snapshots of dinners, meetings, and places where he had spent time alone. And in some, there were people I didn't know. People who smiled at him like I used to, with familiarity I thought belonged only to me. Each image pierced my heart, a quiet, steady ache that grew heavier with every click. Then I found documents I could barely comprehend. Notes in his handwriting that revealed emotional intimacy with someone else. It wasn't just physical distance he had kept from me. It was an entire emotional world, meticulously compartmentalized, that I had never been allowed to enter. The way he had preserved it, organized it, even labeled it, suggested a deliberate, careful life lived alongside ours. I felt sick to my stomach, a cold nausea twisting in my gut. How long had this been happening? How had I been so blind? I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, trying to let the room spin slowly around me. The air felt heavier now, almost stifling. My hands shook, but not with fear, more with a mixture of disbelief, grief, and anger I wasn't ready to fully confront. The house was quiet, too quiet. The only sound the low hum of the laptop and the distant tick of the clock. Even the sunlight filtering through the blinds seemed hesitant, uncertain, as if it knew this discovery had shifted everything. Somewhere in the folders, I found evidence that he had been communicating with someone regularly, almost daily, for years. Messages carefully hidden, documents stored under nondescript titles, plans outlined in detail. He had built an entire parallel existence, one that I had unknowingly lived alongside. And suddenly, the life I thought I had known felt like a shadow, a carefully curated illusion. The contrast was stark and cruel, and I felt both grief and betrayal folding into each other, impossible to untangle. I closed the laptop for a moment, resting my forehead against the top. The cold surface pressed into my skin, grounding me, but also intensifying the ache. I felt my chest rise and fall slowly, trying to steady my breathing, trying to reconcile the man I loved with the stranger I now glimpsed. The familiarity of the chair, the quiet hum of the house, even the soft sunlight, couldn't protect me from the truth any longer. When I finally opened it again, I realized I had crossed a line. I wasn't just discovering things. I was confronting the life he had meticulously hidden. The tension inside me, the tightness in my chest, the fluttering in my stomach, they were all real. And yet, strangely, a small part of me felt alive. Not because of happiness, but because knowledge gave me power. It was the first time since his death that I felt the faint stirrings of control over my own life. The world outside remained quiet. The house seemed to exhale with me as I continued to sift through the folders, aware now that this was only the beginning of understanding the life he had lived without me. I didn't expect the message to hit me the way it did. It was tucked deep in one of the folders, almost hidden, labeled in a way that didn't attract attention at first glance. I clicked on it, and the words spilled across the screen like a punch I wasn't prepared to take. My chest tightened, my hands froze over the keyboard, and for a moment, I felt like the air had been sucked from the room. I read the first line and then the next, the sentences building on one another until the weight of what I was seeing pressed down so hard I could barely breathe. It was him writing, confessing, opening up in ways he had never with me. The words were tender, intimate, detailed. Someone else had been the recipient. The realization hit me slowly at first, then all at once. The man I thought I had known, the husband I had mourned, had shared a side of himself with another that he never shared with me. My stomach turned, and a faint nausea rose. I swallowed hard, trying to ground myself in the room, but the walls seemed to close in as the truth revealed itself. I clicked through more messages. Each one layered another revelation on top of the last. Plans I hadn't known existed. Meetings, gifts, dinner reservations, all meticulously recorded and deliberately hidden. He had been living a parallel life, one that was intimate, deliberate, and completely secret. I felt as if the floor had shifted beneath me. The tiles of our life together were cracking, hidden beneath the polished surface I had trusted. My fingers pressed against my temples as the words blurred together. My own breathing sounded alien in the quiet house. It wasn't just words. There were photographs interspersed between the documents. They weren't casual snapshots. They were moments captured carefully, deliberately. Dinners in dimly lit restaurants, vacations, small smiles exchanged with someone I didn't know. The familiarity in his posture, the way he laughed in those images, it was the same laugh I had loved, but it belonged to someone else. My chest tightened, the ache spreading from my heart into my shoulders. I couldn't believe it, and yet there it was, undeniable. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes for a long moment. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the laptop and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The quiet felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge that I had been living in the shadow of a truth I had no idea existed. Grief and betrayal folded together in my chest, making it difficult to separate the two. The man I had mourned was both gone and unknowable, a stranger hiding in plain sight within our shared life. Somewhere in the documents, I found financial records that aligned with his secret activities, trips he had taken, gifts he had purchased, money exchanged. The pieces fit together in a pattern I hadn't imagined. It wasn't chaotic. It was intentional. Each detail had been carefully cataloged, organized, and protected. I felt the cold swell of anger and hurt rise in my chest, almost like a second heartbeat. He had planned this life alongside ours with precision, ensuring that I would never glimpse it. I sat forward, staring at the screen, my fingers trembling as I scrolled. I found emails that revealed emotional intimacy, conversations that mirrored the depth I had once assumed we shared. And with every word, the sense of betrayal grew heavier. The grief I had been carrying for him suddenly felt tainted with the knowledge that I had been grieving someone I barely knew. My eyes stung as I realized the extent of his deception, the meticulous effort it had taken to hide this life from me. At some point, I realized I was shaking. My hands were cold, pressed against the laptop for warmth I couldn't feel. I rubbed them together, tried to ground myself in the chair, in the room, in the mundane objects around me. But nothing could soften the impact of the truth. Every memory I had of him, the touches, the smiles, the laughter, weighed differently now. They were shadows over a life I had not been allowed to enter. The quiet of the house became suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the wind brushing against the windows, and the soft creak of the floorboards as I shifted in the chair. Each sound reminded me that the world continued outside, oblivious to the storm that had broken inside me. I felt trapped in the knowledge I had uncovered, alone in a room filled with evidence of a life I had never shared. Finally, I closed the folder and leaned back fully, my hands covering my face. I couldn't cry yet, or maybe I wouldn't allow myself to. The mix of emotions, grief, betrayal, confusion, rage, was too complex to unpack all at once. But I knew one thing. I could never look at him the same way again. The man I had loved, trusted, and mourned had left me a map of secrets, carefully hidden until this quiet, painful morning. I left the laptop open but untouched after that, my hands resting in my lap. The room felt heavy but still familiar. I sat in silence for a long while, listening to the faint noises of the house and trying to steady my racing thoughts. The truth had been revealed, quietly, cruelly, and I realized that I was at the beginning of understanding just how far his life had stretched beyond mine. The days that followed felt unreal. I moved through the house like a ghost, carrying the weight of what I had discovered on that first morning. Each room seemed different now. The sunlight that streamed through the blinds no longer brought warmth. It highlighted the emptiness in sharp, unforgiving lines. Even ordinary objects felt alien. The sofa cushions, the dining table, the coffee mugs, each one a reminder of a life that had been carefully constructed around me while simultaneously existing without me. I tried to keep my routine, but it felt impossible. I walked through the kitchen, made breakfast, and poured coffee into my favorite mug, but the familiar smell did nothing to comfort me. My hands shook slightly as I lifted the cup. Even the soft hum of the refrigerator seemed intrusive now, reminding me that the house was alive while I felt frozen in time. I kept glancing toward the office, toward the laptop that had changed everything. The screen sat there quietly, taunting me with the secrets it held. That afternoon, I forced myself to go through more files, even though my body wanted to retreat. There were financial documents that didn't match anything I had seen before, receipts for flights, hotels, and gifts. Some of the charges were subtle, disguised as work expenses, but others were impossible to ignore. I realized he had spent thousands of dollars on someone else, on experiences I had never been part of. Each line in the spreadsheets was a tiny blow, a confirmation that the life I thought we shared was only part of the story. I found more emails, daily communications, long messages, intimate confessions. He had planned trips, sent gifts, and left notes in places I would never look. The meticulousness was almost obsessive. My stomach churned as I realized how deliberate it all was. Every time I thought I understood him, I discovered another layer of concealment. The man I had trusted completely had been living a second life, one that had never intersected with mine except in ways I didn't yet comprehend. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the intelligence behind it. Everything was calculated, perfectly organized, and carefully hidden. Even the times he had returned home late, claimed meetings or errands, now fit into a larger, more deliberate pattern. My chest tightened as I realized the depth of his deception. He had built a life in parallel to mine, a world I had never been allowed to glimpse. And now, sitting alone in the quiet house, I could see it all laid bare. At some point, the emotional weight became almost unbearable. I stood and paced the living room, my hands running over the edges of the couch, the carpet, the windowsill. The house creaked beneath my movements, each sound magnified in the silence. I felt the edges of panic creeping in, a low hum at the back of my mind. But I didn't allow myself to panic. Instead, I tried to channel the storm inside me into focus, trying to understand what had been done and why. The more I looked, the more the details emerged. He had created codes for certain accounts, lists for events, backups of messages that seemed redundant unless someone was trying to hide them. His entire world had been curated, compartmentalized, sealed off from me. And yet, here it was, all accessible, all waiting for me. Couldn't look away. I wanted to, but my mind demanded I see everything, piece by piece. By the second day, I noticed something else. Subtle traces of behavior I had ignored for years. Little patterns I hadn't questioned before. The phone that always disappeared into a pocket. The sudden need for work calls. The trips he'd never mentioned. They were all there, lying quietly in plain sight, and suddenly, everything lined up. The unease I had felt for so long now made sense. I had been living with hints of this double life, but grief had blurred the edges. Now clarity was sharp, cutting like glass. Despite the anger, I felt a strange clarity. The betrayal was undeniable, but knowledge gave me power. For the first time, I felt that I could take steps, deliberate steps, to regain control of my life. I didn't yet know how or what that would look like, but the seed of resolve had been planted. I realized I couldn't change what he had done, but I could decide how I would respond. I closed the laptop for a moment, leaning my forehead against the cold surface. My body ached from tension, my chest still heavy, but my mind was clearer than it had been in days. The house hummed softly around me, ordinary sounds contrasting with the extraordinary revelations I had uncovered. I felt both small and enormous at the same time. Small for the heartbreak, enormous for the awareness that I now possessed. As the day wore on, I moved slowly through the house, letting my thoughts settle into a rhythm. The truth was out. The betrayal had been fully exposed. And in that quiet, reflective space, I realized something profound. I had been given a choice. I could let the pain consume me, or I could learn, plan, and eventually reclaim my life. It was still early, but I felt the first stirrings of resolve, subtle but firm, like a shadow just beginning to stretch toward the light. For the first time since his funeral, I felt the sharp edge of clarity amidst the ache of grief. The house was still silent, but my mind was no longer fogged. I understood now that his secrets weren't just revelations. They were a challenge. And I would meet it.by the third day. I was beginning to organize what I had discovered. I didn't know if it was instinct or a survival mechanism, but my mind demanded order. I opened the laptop again, not to uncover more surprises, but to map out what I already knew. Folders, files, emails, photos. All pieces of a life that had been hidden in plain sight, spread across the screen. I made mental notes of patterns, timelines, locations. It felt clinical, almost like I had stepped into the role of detective. But it wasn't detached. Every discovery carried an ache that settled deep in my chest, a reminder of the trust that had been betrayed. I noticed how methodical he had been. Every email had been saved, every photo dated, every expense accounted for. It wasn't sloppy, careless, or hurried. It was deliberate, careful, and consistent. And that realization made the betrayal feel heavier. He hadn't just hidden moments. He had built an entire second existence with precision, as if anticipating that one day someone might uncover it. And now I was that someone. My hands hovered above the keyboard, and I felt a shiver run through me, not just from cold but from the enormity of what I was seeing. There were receipts from cities I had never visited with him, restaurants I had never stepped foot in, hotels and neighborhoods I didn't recognize. At first, I tried to rationalize them, maybe work trips, maybe gifts for colleagues, but the more I looked, the less plausible that seemed. Each line, each entry told a story I hadn't been part of. My chest tightened as I realized the world I had thought was ours had been only a part of his life. The rest was a private, separate reality that I had unknowingly coexisted alongside. I kept discovering things that contradicted his explanations. Nights he said were spent late at the office or caught in traffic had corresponding emails, photos, or receipts elsewhere. The precision of it made my stomach turn. How long had he managed to keep this up? How many times had I brushed off my instincts, thinking I was imagining things, when the truth was right there? My hands clenched into fists as I realized the extent of the deception. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a meticulously maintained illusion. I found notes that revealed emotional intimacy with someone else, someone who wasn't me. The handwriting, the tone, the careful choice of words, it was deliberate and intentional. I felt a wave of nausea, the kind that makes your stomach churn and your chest feel hollow. I pressed my hands against my thighs, trying to steady myself, but the ache in my heart was relentless. This wasn't just about hidden trips or secret messages. It was about someone I had loved with all my being, living a dual life without ever letting me in. The emotional weight of it was almost too much to carry. I closed the laptop briefly and leaned back in the chair, letting my eyes drift to the window. The sunlight filtered in softly, dust motes floating lazily in the light, and for a moment, I let myself just breathe. But even in that calm, a low, simmering anger began to grow, a quiet determination that mingled with the grief. I had been blindsided, yes, but I wasn't powerless. I realized that knowing the truth, as painful as it was, gave me something I hadn't had before: clarity. I reopened the laptop and kept digging, organizing everything into a mental map of his hidden world. The photos, emails, receipts, they all formed a pattern. I began to understand not just the what, but the how. He had been cautious, but he had also been predictable. His routines, his methods, his careful attention to detail, it all pointed to someone who believed they could manipulate perception without consequence. But now his plans were laid bare. and I had them all. At some point, I noticed a folder I hadn't explored before. Its name was generic, something like miscellaneous, and I hesitated before clicking it. Inside were personal files, messages that revealed his fears, frustrations, and vulnerabilities, but directed at someone else. I could feel my chest tighten, my fingers trembling. The intimacy he had shared in these documents wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, meant for someone else's eyes, and the realization hit me with a sharp, cold clarity. The man I thought I had known, the man I had mourned, had existed in layers I would never access. I sat back and let the room settle around me. The hum of the laptop, the faint ticking of the clock, the soft breeze through the open window. They were the only constants in a world that suddenly felt unrecognizable. I realized that the anger and grief were intertwined, impossible to separate. But somewhere beneath it, a small, quiet resolve began to form. The truth was devastating, yes, but it also gave me a starting point. Knowledge, I realized, was the first step toward reclaiming my life. I closed the laptop for a while and just sat in silence, listening to the familiar yet changed sounds of the house. Each creak, each whisper of wind against the window, felt amplified, reminding me that the life I had known was gone. But for the first time, I also felt something else: control. I could not undo the past, nor could I bring him back, but I could act with intention. The quiet anger that simmered beneath the grief was no longer just pain. It was energy, waiting to be directed. I let the laptop rest beside me, its screen dark and ominous, and leaned my head back. The truth had been revealed, and it was harsh, unrelenting, and complete. And yet, for the first time, I realized that even in the shadow of betrayal, I had a path forward. By the fourth day, the weight of what I had uncovered had settled into a rhythm of its own. I woke early, the sunlight barely touching the edges of the blinds, and moved through the house in a trance. Every room carried reminders of him, but now those reminders were tinged with suspicion. The faint scent of his cologne in the hallway, the folded clothes in the closet, even the way the coffee mug still sat on the counter. They all felt like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. And yet, I couldn't look away. I returned to the laptop, the quiet hum of its fan filling the silence around me. I had begun to notice patterns in his hidden life. Times, locations, interactions. The realization struck me hard. He had not just been careless in hiding things. He had been systematic, meticulous. Every email, every receipt, every document fit together like a carefully constructed blueprint. My stomach tightened as I scrolled, and I felt a growing mix of grief and anger, intertwined in ways that made my chest ache. There were messages that revealed conversations I hadn't known existed. They weren't just casual exchanges. They were intimate, detailed, emotionally revealing. He had shared parts of himself with someone else that he had never shared with me. My hands trembled as I leaned closer to the screen, the soft glow reflecting in my eyes. I felt hollowed out, like a version of myself I had trusted so fully was gone, replaced by the reality of someone I barely recognized. I found travel itineraries and receipts that corresponded to nights he had claimed were spent elsewhere. Every detail aligned perfectly, like a carefully rehearsed script. He had been living a dual existence with precision, and I had been none the wiser. My mind spun as I considered the hours, days, and weeks that had passed without my knowledge. The life I thought we shared had been only a part of the truth. Each discovery pushed the ache deeper, twisting in ways that made my stomach turn and my head pound. I leaned back in the chair, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, and tried to breathe. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and yet I needed to stay present. I had to understand everything before I could process it. I couldn't afford to let my emotions overtake me, even as the sting of betrayal burned through every fiber of my being. I pressed my palms to my eyes, rubbing slowly, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The quiet of the house felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were aware of the secrets I had uncovered. There was a folder I hadn't explored yet, labeled ambiguously. I hesitated before opening it, my hand hovering over the trackpad. When I finally clicked, my breath caught. Inside were photographs, documents, and notes that revealed even more layers of his hidden life. He had carefully documented meetings, dinners, and personal exchanges with someone else. Someone who had been a constant presence in a part of his life I never knew existed. I felt my stomach lurch, my hands tightening around the edge of the desk. The betrayal was more than emotional, it was deliberate. He had taken steps to ensure that I would never discover this life while he lived alongside me. Every routine, every excuse, every late night now made sense in a chillingly clear way. My mind raced through the memories, piecing together moments that had always felt slightly off. The realization made my chest tighten further. I had trusted him fully, given him everything, and he had built an entire world without me. Anger started to rise, slow and steady. Not explosive, not frantic, but deliberate, like the kind of anger that fuels careful decisions. I realized that this anger, combined with my grief, could be dangerous if I allowed it to fester. But I also realized that I could channel it, use it as a tool to reclaim control over a life he had manipulated from behind the scenes. The first stirrings of strategy began to take shape in my mind, tentative and careful, but unmistakable. I continued sifting through the folders, noticing small details I had overlooked before. The way receipts were dated, the way emails were archived, the way messages were phrased. He had been careful, methodical, but he had left a trail. And now, in this quiet house, I was following it. Each revelation brought a mixture of grief and resolve, pain and clarity. The betrayal was real, undeniable, but so was the knowledge I now possessed. By evening, I felt drained but strangely focused. The house was still, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the living room floor. I closed the laptop for a moment, pressing my forehead against its cool surface. The emotional storm had not passed, but a clarity had emerged from it. I understood now that my grief, my hurt, my anger, they were all tools and I could choose how to use them. The life he had hidden from me was vast, but so was my capacity to navigate it. And in that quiet, lonely house, I realized something important. I was no longer a passive observer. I was awake. I was aware. And I would not allow this betrayal to define me. It was on the fifth day that I stumbled upon the folder that changed everything. I had been going through files, emails, and photos methodically, trying to piece together his hidden life, when I noticed a folder tucked deep in the directory with a name so generic I almost skipped it. Something compelled me to open it. The air felt heavier around me as I hovered over the mouse, and when I finally clicked, the contents spilled open like a floodgate I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. Inside were documents and letters that revealed more than I could have imagined. There were personal messages, meticulously written, detailing plans, emotions, even apologies he had offered to someone else. The tone was intimate and familiar, the kind of words that used to be reserved for me. I felt my chest tighten, my throat burn, and my hands tremble. The reality was undeniable. He had been sharing his inner life with someone else, in ways he had never shared with me. There were photographs as well, but not the casual snapshots of trips or dinners. These were moments that captured emotion, smiles, laughter, gestures I thought were mine alone to remember. The images showed him looking at this other person with a tenderness that I had believed belonged only to me. I felt a sharp, hollow ache. My stomach lurched as I realized just how much of himself he had hidden behind a veil of normalcy. Every memory I had of him, the laughter, the touches, the quiet moments in our home, now felt layered, complicated by the knowledge that they were only a part of who he had been. Among the files were financial records showing careful, repeated expenditures for experiences I had never been part of. Dinners, trips, gifts, each one cataloged and accounted for. The sums were significant, not casual, not trivial. My hands shook as I scrolled through them. The meticulousness of it all made the betrayal feel sharper. This wasn't a passing mistake or a momentary lapse. It was a deliberate, calculated life kept separate from mine. I realized then that the scope of his deception went far beyond what I had imagined. He hadn't just been hiding moments. He had created a parallel existence with the precision of someone who planned for every possible contingency. The depth of his care in concealing it all made my chest tighten, a weight that pressed down from the inside. I felt simultaneously sick with grief and fueled by a rising clarity. I found messages that revealed emotional intimacy, detailed conversations that included fears, dreams, and personal reflections, none of which had been shared with me. Reading them, I felt as though I was intruding on a world I had never been allowed to enter. The realization hit hard. The man I had mourned was a stranger in many ways. And yet, the emotions I had invested in him, the life we had shared, were still real. They were mine, but they were incomplete. The more I read, the more the pattern became clear. He had not just hidden time or money. He had hidden himself. Every late night, every unexplained absence, every sudden call that he didn't fully explain now fit into a timeline that made sense, and made my chest ache. The betrayal was not random or chaotic. It was planned, deliberate, and consistent. Every careful step, every concealed detail, pointed to someone who had wanted to live a separate life while maintaining the illusion of ours. I leaned back, pressing my face into my hands. The house was silent, save for the low hum of the laptop and the faint ticking of the clock. I felt both crushed and strangely alert. My grief, my anger, my disbelief, they all intertwined, creating a knot I couldn't untangle. And yet beneath it, a small voice whispered that I could use this knowledge, that awareness could be a tool, that I could act with intention. I continued sifting through the documents for hours, piecing together timelines, cross-referencing messages, tracking patterns. I discovered details that explained past inconsistencies, moments I had brushed off as forgetfulness or coincidence. The precision with which he had orchestrated this hidden life made me realize just how clever and careful he had been. And with that realization came a strange sense of empowerment. The betrayal was devastating, but the truth, fully revealed, was mine to navigate. By evening, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the living room floor. I closed the laptop, resting my forehead against the cool surface. My hands were sore from scrolling and my chest ached from the emotional weight. Yet for the first time I felt a subtle shift. I wasn't just a victim of his deception. I was aware, informed, and capable. I could decide what to do with this knowledge. The revelation was complete. The extent of his hidden life, the emotional connections, the meticulous concealment. It all lay bare before me. And in that quiet house, I understood something crucial. Grief and betrayal could coexist with clarity and purpose. The truth was painful, but it was also a starting point. And with that starting point, I knew I had to choose how to move forward carefully, deliberately, on my own terms. It was late that evening when I discovered the final pieces of his hidden life, the ones that tied everything together and made the full picture undeniable. I had been going through emails and documents in a quiet, deliberate way, trying to understand the scope of what he had concealed. That's when I found a folder labeled with a date that seemed ordinary, almost nondescript. I clicked it and froze. Inside were files that detailed plans, conversations, and moments I hadn't yet seen. They revealed not just secrecy, but intention. I realized with a jolt that he had anticipated being discovered. Every hidden message, every coded folder, every careful note was cataloged in a way that suggested he expected me to eventually look. It was as if he had built this second life not only to exist alongside mine, but to challenge me, to test whether I could uncover it. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. My hands trembled as I scrolled through each document, my chest tightening with the weight of his careful duplicity. There were personal letters, conversations with someone else that were deeply intimate, emotionally revealing in ways that I had never experienced with him. Reading them, I felt a hollow ache, a sense of both loss and clarity. He had given pieces of himself that I thought were mine alone to someone else, carefully, deliberately. The anger bubbled up beneath the grief, sharp and quiet, and I realized that this was not just about betrayal, it was about control. He had controlled the narrative, controlled my perception, controlled what I could see and when. Then I found something that stunned me even more. A series of plans and correspondence that revealed he had been considering major life changes without ever consulting me. Trips, financial decisions, personal arrangements, it was all recorded, all decided. My mind reeled as I understood the depth of his independence and how little of our shared life had actually been shared. I felt simultaneously small and enormous, crushed by the enormity of his deception yet empowered by the knowledge I now possessed. I sat back in the chair, letting the weight of the discoveries settle over me. The room was quiet except for the hum of the laptop and the faint creak of the house settling around me. Sunlight had faded, leaving the living room bathed in soft, dim light. I rubbed my temples slowly, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The emotional exhaustion was palpable, but beneath it, a growing clarity emerged. I could not change the past, but I could choose my response to it. The realization hit me fully. He had been living a parallel life with precision, thoughtfulness, and even affection, but I had been excluded. The betrayal was complete, but so was the map he had unintentionally left behind. I could trace his movements, his interactions, his intentions. For the first time, I understood not only what he had done but how. And with that understanding came a quiet determination. The anger and grief were powerful, but knowledge was sharper. I noticed patterns I hadn't seen before. Specific times, dates, sequences of interactions. They all pointed to a deliberate rhythm in his hidden life. Every detail he had meticulously maintained, every plan he had executed with care, now offered me insight. It was a strange combination of horror and fascination, realizing how clever and careful he had been. I felt the first flicker of control since discovering the laptop. I was no longer just a passive observer. I had a clear understanding of the full scope. By the end of the evening, I had documented everything mentally, piecing together the network of secrets, plans, and connections he had built. Each revelation had been like a small cut, but together, they formed a deep, undeniable truth. The grief remained, heavy and constant, but beneath it was a quiet fire. I felt ready to act, not impulsively, not recklessly, but with a measured, deliberate approach. He had hidden, deceived, and controlled. Now it was my turn to reclaim control in a way that was my own. I closed the laptop slowly, resting my forehead against the cool surface. The house was still and quiet, the dim light casting long shadows across the floor. I could hear my own breathing, steady but deliberate, as I allowed the truth to settle fully in my mind. The realization was overwhelming, yes, but also strangely grounding. I understood the full breadth of his hidden life, and with that understanding came clarity, focus, and purpose. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a sense of direction. The grief and betrayal were still there, palpable and raw, but the chaos that had filled my mind was beginning to coalesce into something actionable. I knew that the knowledge I now held was both power and responsibility. And as the night stretched on, I realized something crucial. I had seen the truth, and with that truth, I could decide how my life would move forward. The final pieces of his hidden life were no longer secrets. They were facts, undeniable and complete. And in the quiet of that dimly lit living room, I understood that the life he had carefully concealed could no longer define me. I could grieve, I could mourn, but I could also act with intention. The storm of betrayal had passed, leaving in its wake a quiet, steady resolve that I had never felt before. After days of sifting through his hidden life, the clarity I had gained was both exhausting and empowering. I understood everything now, the secrets, the meticulous planning, the emotional intimacy he had shared with someone else. The betrayal had been deliberate, calculated, and consistent. But I realized something important. I didn't need to act out of anger or desperation. I didn't need to lash out. What I could do, what I would do, was reclaim my life with intention and precision. I began by taking small steps. The first was practical. I changed passwords, secured accounts, and carefully documented everything I had uncovered. I made lists of important dates, financial transactions, and hidden connections. Every detail mattered because knowledge was now my tool. For the first time since discovering his hidden life, I felt a sense of control. The weight of betrayal was still heavy, but it was no longer crushing. It had been transformed into a quiet, focused energy that I could direct. I also began to detach emotionally, not to suppress the grief, but to create a space where I could think clearly. I knew I couldn't erase the hurt, but I could decide how it would shape me. I reminded myself that revenge didn't have to be loud or violent. It could be subtle, intelligent, and deliberate. could be measured. The knowledge I possessed gave me power. And with power, I could act in ways that were both strategic and meaningful. One evening, I decided to go through the documents again, this time with a different perspective. I wanted to identify every inconsistency, every hidden transaction, every pattern that could inform my next steps. I took meticulous notes, cross-referencing receipts, emails, and messages. Each discovery wasn't just a reminder of betrayal. It was a blueprint for understanding his actions and motivations. The realization was sobering, but also empowering. I wasn't just uncovering the past. I was preparing to take control of my present and future. I also made changes in my daily life, small but deliberate. I started organizing my home differently, clearing clutter, creating boundaries that he had never respected. The house felt lighter, cleaner, safer. Each action was a quiet declaration. This was my space, my life, my rules. It was a subtle but powerful form of justice, reclaiming territory he had taken for granted, asserting control over the environment he had once dominated. At night, I reflected on what I had learned. I allowed myself to feel the grief fully, but I paired it with determination. I realized that my revenge didn't need to hurt him. It needed to restore me. The betrayal had taken years from my sense of trust, my sense of safety, and my peace of mind. Reclaiming those things was the most effective form of justice. It was quiet, invisible, but far more powerful than any impulsive action could have been. I also began to consider how I would share this knowledge with others if necessary. Not to shame or humiliate, but to protect myself and to ensure that the truth was acknowledged in the right context. Every decision was carefully weighed. I didn't want to act recklessly. I wanted to be strategic, patient, and deliberate. Each step I took felt like planting a seed of justice, quiet, controlled, and effective. The process wasn't easy. Some mornings, grief returned with full force, crashing over me in waves that left me breathless. Other days, anger flared unexpectedly, a reminder that healing was not linear. But through it all, I clung to the clarity I had gained from the documents, the evidence, the patterns I had uncovered. They reminded me that I had agency. I could choose my response. I could reclaim my life without losing myself to bitterness or desperation. I also focused on small victories, paying off debts he had hidden, reclaiming accounts he had controlled, making personal decisions without hesitation. Each action was a reclaiming of power. I realized that this quiet form of revenge was not about spectacle. It was about restoring balance. He had stolen trust and security, but he could not steal my ability to rebuild them. Each step was deliberate, considered, and meaningful. By the end of the week, I felt a profound shift. The anger and grief were still present, but they were no longer paralyzing. Instead, they had transformed into focus, clarity, and resolve. I had reclaimed my environment, my privacy, my agency. I had turned betrayal into understanding, grief into strategy, and loss into empowerment. My revenge would not be violent or public. It would be controlled, quiet, and effective, a restoration of the life that had been undermined. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm in the house. The shadows that had felt heavy now seemed manageable. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was reflective. And in that calm, I understood something vital. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it is quiet, deliberate, and completely in your control. And that, I realized, was more powerful than I could have imagined. Weeks passed, and the house began to feel like my own again. The weight of grief and betrayal had not disappeared, but it had shifted. The sharp edge of shock had dulled, leaving a quiet awareness. I moved through the rooms differently now, noticing small details I had ignored before. The sunlight catching the edge of the window frame, the faint scent of coffee lingering on the counter, the soft hum of the refrigerator. These ordinary things felt grounding, reassuring, proof that life continued even after devastation. I had begun to reclaim routines I had abandoned in the wake of discovery. Morning coffee became a ritual, a small act of control over my day. I organized my home meticulously, not out of obsession, but to restore order to a space that had felt infiltrated by secrets. Each drawer, each shelf, Each corner of the house felt like a claim of my own reality. The environment, once tinged with reminders of betrayal, now became a place of reflection and strength. Emotionally, I felt different too. The grief still lingered, it had to, but it was tempered by clarity. I understood that he had led a life I could never share, and that truth was painful. But I also realized that I could choose how to let it shape me. I could wallow in resentment, or I could focus on rebuilding, on reclaiming trust in myself. I chose the latter. The betrayal no longer defined me. It informed me. I found myself thinking back on our life together, revisiting memories that once felt purely joyful. Some still stung, sharp reminders of what had been lost, but others felt bittersweet, nuanced by my awareness of his hidden self. I allowed myself to grieve the man I thought I knew while acknowledging that he had been, in many ways, a stranger. The duality was strange, uncomfortable, but necessary for healing. One evening, I sat in the living room with the laptop closed beside me. I didn't need to open it anymore. Not yet, anyway. I had seen the full extent of his secret life, and the knowledge had allowed me to make peace with what I could control. I realized that the revenge I had planned, the quiet reclaiming of my space and agency, had already begun. Every intentional choice I made in my life became part of that process. Every boundary I set, every decision I took for myself was a subtle form of justice. I also noticed a shift in how I approached relationships. I became more vigilant, not suspicious, but discerning. I valued honesty and transparency in ways I hadn't before. The betrayal had been painful, yes, but it had also taught me to recognize patterns, to listen to instincts, to trust myself. My interactions with friends and family felt richer, more grounded, because I understood the importance of clarity and boundaries. I refused to allow manipulation or secrecy into my life again. The quiet revenge I had cultivated, reclaiming control, asserting boundaries, carefully managing my environment, felt satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't dramatic or public, but it was effective. It restored dignity, trust in myself, and a sense of autonomy I had lost without even realizing it. I felt empowered not by retaliation, but by deliberate action. The subtle justice I enacted became a source of strength, a reminder that even after deep betrayal, life could be rebuilt thoughtfully and intentionally. As the days passed, I allowed myself moments of reflection. I thought about what I had learned from this experience. The importance of self-trust, the necessity of boundaries, and the realization that betrayal, while devastating, could also be transformative. The man I had loved had hidden himself in ways I could never reconcile, but the life I was building now was fully mine. I had agency, insight, and clarity. Those truths became my foundation for moving forward. I also forgave myself in a way, not for what he had done, but for the blind trust one had placed in him. I recognized that my vulnerability had been sincere and genuine, and that it was not a flaw to be ashamed of. I could honor the love I had given while acknowledging the deception I had endured. That balance was delicate, but it allowed me to reclaim my own narrative without losing the part of myself that loved deeply. By the end of the month, the house no longer felt haunted by his secrets. It felt like a space I had reconstructed, a reflection of my own resilience. I could sit in silence and feel calm, breathe without tension, and walk through each room knowing that I had taken control of my life. The laptop, once the source of heartbreak, now sat quietly on the desk, a reminder not of betrayal, but of clarity and power. And finally, I understood the lesson I had been given. Life does not stop when trust is broken. Grief and betrayal are heavy, but they can coexist with strength, insight, and intention. Revenge does not have to be loud or destructive to be effective. Sometimes, the quiet reclaiming of self is the most powerful act of all. I had learned to move forward deliberately, to honor my own truth, and to create a life that was fully, authentically mine. If you've ever trusted someone completely, only to have the truth hidden from you, you know the weight of that betrayal. I shared my story not to shock, but to show that even in the darkest moments, there's strength in clarity and power in reclaiming your life. If this story resonated with you, or if you've faced secrets and lies of your own, I invite you to stay with me. Click to watch my previous stories. Everyone is a real journey through heartbreak, revelation, and quiet justice. You're not alone in this. Let these stories remind you that even when the people we love betray us, we can rise stronger, smarter, and more resilient than ever. Don't just leave yet. If you're ready to see how truth and courage can transform a life, hit play on the next story and let it empower you, just as it empowered me.